Good evening and welcome. Tonight I am so excited to bring you the Atlas Obscura. I love this website and this book is so cool. It's one that I wanted to purchase even before I started this channel, and I nearly did many times, but just never had the money to do so. And thankfully, a viewer donated it to my channel from my Amazon wish list. So thank you so very kindly. If you want to check out my book list on my wish list, it's down in the description box. You can send me a book, you can donate it to me, and I'll read it on my channel and shout you out and everything. So anyway, like I said, I love this book. It's so cool. And check out the back. This really shows why I like it so much, because look, there is little blurbs from Neil Gaiman, my favorite author of all time. Mary Roach, whose book Stiff is amazing. And Guillermo del Toro, one of my favorite directors. The Shape of Water and Pan's Labyrinth are two of my favorite movies ever. So that just goes to show it's a really good book. So we're going to start off with the very first chapter of this book. Let's see. So here we're going to start off in Europe. We're going to read this section about Great Britain and Ireland, about England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. Apparently Wales is not weird enough to make it into the book. So, if you're wondering, hold on, what exactly is this book supposed to be? Oh, there's fuzz on my jacket, hold on. It is a big, long description, I suppose. Summaries of very weird and strange places on Earth. Some are creepy, some are natural landmarks, some are just weird places. So let's just dive right in. Let's start off in England. We have the Silver Swan in Newgate, Durham. This uncannily lifelike musical automaton mimics a full-size swan floating on a pond of spun glass rods. Created in the 1770s, it uses 3 clockwork mechanisms to perform a 40-second routine set to calming bell-like music. When wound, the swan moves its neck from side to side to preen its feathers before dipping its beak into the pond and snatching up a tiny fish. First displayed in British jeweler James Cox's Mechanical Museum, the swan was purchased by collector John Bowes in 1872 and is now housed in the Bowes Museum, a French chateau in the north of England. There's a whole page here about other little machines like the swan. There's some neat pages that go into more detail about some of the weird stuff, but maybe we'll read those pages on another day. Right now, let's just stick to the locations. Next is the Poison Garden in Alnwick, Northumberland. To enter the Poison Garden of Alnwick, you must first fetch a guide to unlock the black iron gates, which are decorated with a white skull and crossbones and a worrying message: these plants can kill. Inspired by the poison gardens in 16th century Padua, where the Medicis plotted the frothing ends of their royal enemies, the Duchess of Northumberland created this garden in 2005, dedicating it entirely to poisonous or narcotic flora. The Duchess, Jane Percy, is an unlikely patron. In 1995, her husband unexpectedly became the 12th Duke of Northumberland, following his brother's death, and Alnwick Castle fell into their family's care. Roaming the elaborate gardens, the newly minted Duchess decided to transform an overgrown, neglected section into something that was once both traditional and dangerous. The Poison Garden now sits nestled among 14 acres of greenery, dotted with water sculptures, a cherry orchard, a bamboo labyrinth, and an enormous treehouse. This carefully curated garden contains about 100 plants that have the power to stimulate, intoxicate, sicken, or kill. Guides detail their dangerous properties while enforcing the strict no touching, no smelling rules. Poppies, cannabis, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and deadly strychnine are among the innocent-looking greenery. Because of the danger posed by the flora, some can kill or sicken just through touch. Some plants are caged, and the garden is secured under a 24-hour security watch. Next is the Chained Books of Hereford Cathedral in Hereford, in Herefordshire. This cathedral contains two medieval marvels, a chained library of rare books and one of the earliest maps of the world. In the Middle Ages, before the availability of the printing press, volumes on law and religion were quite rare and valuable. To protect against theft, the books at Hereford Cathedral were chained to desks, pulpits, and study tables. The chained library was created in 1611 when a collection of hand-transcribed, hand-bound books was moved into the Lady Chapel. Most of the volumes in the collection are acquisitions dating back to the 1100s, although the oldest book in the collection, the Hereford Gospels, dates to about the year 800. The medieval world map stored at Hereford Cathedral depicts 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. On the as-of-yet unexplored periphery of these lands roam fire-breathing dragons, dog-faced men, people who survive on only the scent of apples, and the Monocoli, a race of mythical beings who take shade under their giant feet when the sun becomes too bright. The 5 by 4.5 foot map created around 1300 is part geography, part history, and part religious teaching aid. A lack of confirmed information on Asian and African geography presented no obstacle for the map maker, who used hearsay, mythology, and imagination to fill in the gaps, which explains the four-eyed Ethiopians. Next is the mechanical clock at Salisbury Cathedral in Salisbury, Wiltshire. The mechanical clock at Salisbury Cathedral is old, but just how old is the subject of ongoing debate. The exact date is a matter of importance, for if it was built in 1386, as many horologists believe, it is the oldest working clock in the world. The faceless clock introduced Salisbury to the new concept of standardized hours, which would replace the season-based increments of the sundial era. It chimed hourly, reminding townspeople to attend church services, and provided a reliable structure for each day. In 1928, following its rediscovery in the cathedral tower, the clock was disassembled and restored. Although it no longer chimes, today the clock functions in much the same way as it did more than 600 years ago, striking away the hours in the north aisle of the nave. Next is the Tempest Prognosticator in Oakhampton, Devon. Surgeon George Merriweather had a passion for leeches. According to Merriweather, the creepy worms possessed human-like instincts, experienced the hollow ache of loneliness, and were capable of forecasting weather. All this gave him an idea for a machine that he believed could transform meteorology. In 1851, Merriweather unveiled his Tempest Prognosticator at the Great Exhibition in London. Having witnessed the agitation of freshwater leeches during the lead-up to a heavy storm, the doctor concluded he could build a leech-powered weather forecasting device. The contraption resembled a miniature merry-go-round, but in place of the usual ponies were a dozen glass bottles, each containing a single leech. Should a storm approach, the creatures would make their way to the top of the glass, triggering a wire connected to a central bell. Though certainly novel, Merriweather's invention did not catch on. His vision of the British government deploying Tempest prognosticators nationwide remained mere fantasy. but his invention lives on in the form of a reconstructed version prominently displayed in the Barometer World Exhibition Museum in Devon. Another can be found in the Whitby Museum in North Yorkshire. Next is the Whitley Underwater Ballroom in Godalming. The 9,000-acre Victorian estate of James Whittaker Wright was extravagant in every way. With the fortune he made from years of financial fraud, Wright built a 32-room mansion set on lavishly landscaped grounds that included 3 artificial lakes. Hidden underneath one of the lakes is his most spectacular creation of all, the underwater ballroom. Built just below the surface of the water, this glorious submerged room has a domed, glass-paneled aquarium roof crowned with an epic statue that rises above the lake as if it's floating on the water. Called a ballroom due to its round shape and overall grandeur, the room was actually a smoking room where Wright would entertain his lucky guests. It was splendid, and like everything else on Wright's estate, it was ultimately doomed. Wright built his palatial home with the money he made from swindling investors out of millions of dollars. In 1904, he was caught, convicted of fraud, and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But Wright would never serve time. In a court anteroom, he took his own life by swallowing a cyanide pill immediately after the sentencing. After his death, the estate was purchased by Irish shipbuilder William Peary of SS Titanic fame. The mansion was destroyed in a fire in 1952, but the now ancient-looking ballroom is still there, algae-covered and rusting away beneath the lake. The No Man's Land Luxury Seafort in Gosport, Hampshire. On maps, it registers as a tiny, nameless speck in the Solent Strait between mainland England and the Isle of Wight. But No Man's Land Fort has a dramatic history that belies its cartographic insignificance. Built in the late 1800s to protect the English coast against a French invasion that never happened, No Man's Land could accommodate 80 soldiers and 49 cannons. The 200-foot wide fort sat idle for decades, and the Ministry of Defense decommissioned No Man's Land in the 1950s. When the government tried to sell it in 1963, no buyers came forward. In the 1990s, the abandoned fort was transformed into a luxury hotel, complete with 2 helipads, 21 bedrooms, a roof garden, and restaurants. The submerged center was glassed in as an atrium for the heated pool. Despite its creature comforts and promise of privacy, the hotel never took off. In 2004, developer Harmesh Puni bought No Man's Land for £6 million with the intention of renting it out for special occasions. Unfortunately, contaminated water in the hotel pool caused an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. Faced with financial ruin and the possibility of losing the island, Puni took an extreme approach. He covered the helipads with upturned tables, grabbed his keys, and barricaded himself inside the fortress. After a protracted standoff, he was finally evicted in early 2009. No Man's Land sold for the bargain price of £910,000 in March 2009 to Gibraltar-based Swan Estates Limited. The fort has since been transformed into a venue for weddings and corporate retreats. Standout features include a sauna, a cabaret club, and a laser tag arena located in the former gunpowder storage area. Wow, let's look at this first. The Great Stone Sound Mirrors in Greatstone, Kent. As part of its national defense strategy after World War I, Britain built 3 massive concrete acoustic mirrors on the southeast coast of England to detect the sound of distant airplane engines in the sky. Working much like giant ears, the trio of reflectors could provide a 15-minute warning of an air invasion by magnifying the sound waves over the English Channel and directing them at microphones. An operator sitting in a nearby booth listened to the transmitted signal through headphones that resembled a stethoscope. The Great Stone site features 3 different reflectors, including a 200-foot long curved wall, a 30-foot tall parabolic dish, and a 20-foot tall shallow dish. So this is, over here, the Monsell Army Sea Forts in the Thames estuary off the east coast of England. Rising from the water like robotic sentinels on stilts, the Monsell Army Sea Forts in the Thames estuary east of London are rusting reminders of World War II's darkest days. Part of the Thames Estuary Defense Network, the anti-aircraft tower forts were constructed in 1942 to deter German air raids. Each of the 3 original forts consisted of a cluster of 7 buildings on stilts surrounding a central command tower. 2 remain, the Red Sands Fort and the Shivering Sands Fort. After their wartime career, the forts were decommissioned. In the 1960s, pirate radio broadcasters moved in and established unauthorized stations in the remaining forts. In 1966, Reginald Calvert, manager of the Radio City Pirate Station, died in a fight with rival Radio Caroline station owner Oliver Smedley. The next year, the British government passed legislation making offshore broadcasting illegal, driving out the pirates and leaving the forts abandoned. Very cool. Here's the long player. If you miss hearing Long Player on your next trip to London, you'll get the chance to catch it again. The musical composition will be playing in the old lighthouse at Trinity Buoy Wharf for the next 1,000 years. Long Player consists of 6 short recorded pieces written for Tibetan singing bowls that are transposed and combined in such a way that the variations will never repeat during the song's millennium-long run. It began playing on December 31st, 1999, and is scheduled to end in the dying seconds of 2999. Custodians of the project have established the Long Player Trust to devise ways of keeping the music alive in the face of the inevitable technological and social changes that will occur over the next 10 centuries. Jeremy Bentham's auto icon in London. Jeremy Bentham has been sitting in a corridor at University College London since 1850. The moral philosopher, whose advocacy of animal welfare, prison reform, universal suffrage, and gay rights was far ahead of his time, left a will with specific instructions on the treatment of his corpse. He decreed that his mummified head and skeleton be clad in a black suit, seated upright on a chair in a wooden cabinet, under a placard reading Auto Icon. He also suggested that his corpse could preside over regular meetings of followers of his utilitarian philosophy. There's Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's plans for his remains became something of an obsession. For 10 years prior to his death, he reportedly carried a pair of glass eyes in his pocket so that embalmers could easily implant them after his death. Unfortunately, when the time came, something went wrong in the preservation process. Bentham's head took on a mottled, hollow-cheeked look, its leathery skin sagging under the pair of intensely blue glass eyes. In order to create a less grotesque display, preservers created a wax bust of Bentham and screwed it onto the skeleton. They placed the real head beneath Bentham's feet. Ba-boom. There it sat, undisturbed, until 1975, when a group of mischievous students kidnapped it and demanded a £100 ransom be donated to charity. The university made a counteroffer of £10, and the students caved, returning Bentham's head to its rightful place between its legs. After a few more pranks, including one in which the skull was apparently used as a football, university administrators decided to remove the head from public display. Now sits in the conservation safe in the Institute of Archaeology and is removed only for special occasions. Archie the Giant Squid in London. The giant squid is often depicted as a sea monster. In Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a giant squid attacks a boat and devours one of its crew. The Kraken of Norse mythology, an enormous creature whose tentacles could supposedly wrap around the tallest of ship masts and rip whole vessels asunder, likely arose from a combination of giant squid sightings, imagination, and exaggeration. The deep-sea dwelling giant squid's notorious elusiveness only fueled tall tales. Though records show they have been sighted sporadically since the 16th century, it wasn't until 2002 that photographers were able to capture an image of a live giant squid in its natural habitat, which makes the Natural History Museum's 28-foot specimen a rare delight. Caught off the coast of the Falkland Islands in 2004 and named Archie in recognition of its species name, Architeuthis dux, the giant squid is preserved in a custom-made acrylic tank. It's the size of a school bus. Next is Highgate Cemetery in London. Opened in 1839, Highgate is one of London's most famous cemeteries. Its residents include Karl Marx, his memorial recognizable by the glowering bearded bust, sci-fi author Douglas Adams, one of the best, and Adam Worth, the possible inspiration for Sherlock Holmes's nemesis, Professor Moriarty. In the Victorian era, anyone who was anyone wanted to be buried in London's fashionable Highgate Cemetery. But fashion is fickle. By the 1940s, the Victorian cemetery was in a state of neglect, its once coveted burial plots covered in vines. In 1970, members of a group interested in the occult claimed to have seen supernatural creatures lurking in the graveyard. Initial reports of ghosts gave way to talk that a vampire, a Transylvanian prince brought to the cemetery in the 1800s, was hiding out in Highgate. Sean Manchester and David Ferrant, self-described magicians and rival monster hunters, vowed to track down and kill the beast. Each proclaimed the other to be a charlatan incapable of finding the vampire. They took their feud to the media, capitalizing on an interest in the occult fueled by the recent release of The Exorcist, and announced an official vampire hunt would take place on Friday the 13th of March 1970. That night, a mob overpowered police and broke into Highgate, wielding stakes, garlic, crosses, and holy water. Chaos ensued. No vampires were sighted. Manchester and Ferrant continued to visit the cemetery over the next few years, determined to drive a stake into the heart of the Highgate vampire. Though neither magician ever found the supposed vampire, real graves were ransacked and real corpses staked and beheaded during the search. In 1974, Ferrant received a jail sentence for vandalizing memorials and interfering with human remains in the cemetery. Debate between Ferrant and Manchester continues to this day, while the cemetery remains a popular location for occult, paranormal, and vampire enthusiasts. It's so bizarre. The last one in England tonight is Difference Engine number 2 in London. There was almost a Victorian computer. Charles Babbage came achingly close with his 1822 Difference Engine, a design for a hulking gadget with cranks and gears capable of generating mathematical tables. The machine offered a well-thought-out solution to the problem of human error in complex calculations, but it proved too large, complicated, and expensive to construct. Government grants allowed Babbage to hire a machinist, Joseph Clement, but after 10 years and much quarreling over prices, Clement had built just a small portion of the prototype. Undeterred by practical constraints and workplace unpleasantness, Babbage moved on to plans for Difference Engine number 2. This would be a more streamlined version, 5 tons, 5,000 parts, and 11 feet long. It too never progressed to a working model. Babbage died in 1871, leaving reams of notes and sketches for machines that were beyond the era's construction capabilities. In 1985, more than a century after Babbage's death, London Science Museum announced plans to investigate the feasibility of his designs by building a difference engine based on the blueprints and 19th century materials devised for engine number 2. The construction team finished the calculating section in 1991, just in time to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Babbage's birth. It functioned flawlessly, confirming Babbage's rightful place in the annals of computing history. The engine, which features a printing apparatus added in 2002, is now on display at the museum, along with half of Babbage's brain. The other half is housed at the Hunterian Museum, also in London. Moving on to Ireland, which all my Irish viewers, feel free to make fun of any mispronunciation I make. We have Victor's Way Indian Sculpture Park in Roundwood, Wicklow. Covering 22 acres, this park includes sculptures of an emaciated Buddha, an enormous disembodied finger, and the split man, a figure ripping itself in two, representing the mental state of the dysfunctional human. Victor Langeld established the park in 1989 after traveling to India in search of spiritual enlightenment. The series of sculptures, carved in stone by craftsmen in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, represent spiritual progression from awakening, a child emerging from a decayed fist, to the ferryman's end, a cadaverous old man in a sinking boat half submerged in a lake. There he is. Very creepy. Next is the ruins of the MV Plassey in Inisheer, Galway. More rust than metal at this point, the creaky shell of the steam trawler MV Plassey has been sitting on a bed of rocks on the shore of Inisheer Island for over half a century. Early in the morning of March 8, 1960, the cargo ship was transporting yarn, stained glass, and whiskey across the Atlantic when it got caught in a terrible storm. Fierce winds blew the vessel toward Inisheer, tearing a hole in the bottom and causing water to rush into the engine room. Using a breeches buoy, a rocket-fired rescue device similar to a zip line, islanders managed to save all 11 members of the crew from the ICC. No sooner had they warmed up and calmed down with a few shots of local whiskey than another storm hit, delivering the MV Plassey to the rocky coast of Inisheer. Locals salvaged wool, lumber, and doors for construction, and made off with a stash of black and white scotch hidden in the hold. Today, the bronze-colored wreck, riddled with holes and stripped of all its assets, looks oddly beautiful against the grey rocks, green grass, and blue sky. Next is the Leviathan of Parsonstown in Burr Offaly? I'm not sure. Never heard of that place. William Parsons, the 3rd Earl of Ross, I believe, built this 58-foot telescope in the 1840s to investigate the space phenomena he knew as nebulae. At the time, telescopes were not powerful enough to show that the so-called nebulae were actually an assortment of different objects ranging from star clusters and galaxies to clouds of gas and dust. Parsons' 6-foot-wide telescope lens exposed the solar system in greater detail than ever before, though it was not until the 1920s that Edwin Hubble discovered that some of the fuzzy objects were in fact galaxies. Dubbed the Leviathan of Parsonstown, Parsons' reflecting telescope remained the largest in the world for over 75 years. However, following the death of the Earl of Ross and that of his son, who tended the instrument in his absence, the telescope fell into disuse in 1878 and was dismantled in 1908. Thanks to the 7th and current Earl, the telescope was reconstructed in the late 1990s with a new mirror and motors. You can now see the restored Leviathan and learn about its workings in the attached Science Center. Next is the Irish Sky Garden in Skibbereen, Ireland. Designed by American James Turrell in 1992, this magical knoll is an unparalleled piece of public art. The enormous grassy crater features a central stone plinth reminiscent of ancient Celtic and Egyptian altars. The plinth rises up at an angle, and a stone footrest on each end allows the viewer to lie down and see up and out toward the edge of the crater above. I wish there was a picture of it. All that is visible from this vantage point is the green grass and sky, creating a uniquely serene experience that invokes past rituals and ancient rites. The Sky Garden is set in the natural landscape of the Lissard, or High Fort in Gaelic, estate, which is situated on an ancient Celtic ring fort. So even though the Sky Garden is a contemporary piece of art with a strikingly postmodern shape and aesthetic, it is the perfect complement to a place that is already a bridge between two worlds. Next is Skellig Michael in the Skelligs in Kerry, which if you're a Star Wars fan, you recognize this totally. The dozen monks who sequestered themselves on this rocky island in the 7th century were a hardy lot. Skellig Michael, Skellig is derived from the Irish word that, meaning steep rock, lies 8 miles from the coast of County Kerry. It is beset by wind and rain, which make the ascent to its 714-foot-high peak extra treacherous. Despite these harsh conditions, a group of determined Irish Christians established a monastic outpost on the island that remains largely intact 1,400 years later. Using stones, the monks built hundreds of stairs leading up to Skellig Michael's summit, where they erected 6 beehive-shaped stone huts and a small chapel. They survived on a diet of fish, seabirds, and vegetables grown in the monastery garden. Withstanding multiple Viking raids during the 9th century, the monks occupied Skellig Michael until the late 12th century, when frequent storms sent them back to the mainland. Climbing the 670 uneven steep steps to the top presents both a physical and mental challenge, but at the summit you'll be able to enter the monastic huts and imagine the grueling life of a 7th century ascetic. Next is the crypts at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. In 1030, the Viking rulers of Dublin built the original Christ Church Cathedral out of wood. When the Normans invaded in 1171, they tore the cathedral down and built one of stone, adding an enormous crypt. Lawrence O'Toole, the Archbishop of Dublin, oversaw the rebuilding process. After O'Toole was canonized as the patron saint of Dublin in 1225, his heart was preserved in a heart-shaped reliquary and kept in the cathedral inside an iron cage. The saintly heart remained in an alcove until March 2012, when 2 men pried open the cage and stole the icon. 6 years later, the heart was recovered by police and restored to its proper place. Other fascinating relics worth seeing are a set of stocks made in 1670 that were once used outdoors to punish criminals publicly, and a marble monument depicting Nathaniel Sneyd, an Irish politician who died in 1833. Text beside the sculpture states that he perished by the indiscriminating violence of an unhappy maniac. In other words, he was shot. The most unusual objects in the crypt are the mummified cat and rat, whose poses suggest they died mid-chase. According to church lore, the cat pursued the rat into a pipe of the church organ during the 1850s, and both became stuck. James Joyce used both cat and rat as a simile in Finnegan's Wake when he described someone as being as stuck as that cat to that mouse in that tube of that Christ Church organ. Very James Joyce of him to say. Ooh, the Giant's Causeway. But first, let's talk about the Vanishing Lake. We're obviously up in Northern Ireland now. We're at Ballycastle in Antrim. Ballycastle. East of the seaside town of Ballycastle, on the side of the coastal road, is a lake, sometimes. When you get there, it may be gone, but it will come back. Luarima, also known as the Vanishing Lake, sits on a bed of porous limestone with a plug hole that attracts peat. When enough peat accumulates in the hole, it prevents drainage, causing the water level to rise. When the peat dislodges, the lake empties, sometimes disappearing in a matter of hours. There's the lake. Let's talk about the Giant's Causeway. Yes, my landlady's roosters are popping off. Sorry about that. This is a place I really want to go see. It looks so cool. This is at the Bushmills, also in Antrim. I'm not sure. With its thousands of interlocking hexagonal columns that rise vertically like steps, the Giant's Causeway is a geological oddity that looks distinctly man-made. Volcanic activity created the unusual formation near the start of the Paleogene period, when molten basalt came into contact with chalk beds and formed a lava plateau. Hold on, there is a hair that's bothering me. I don't know if you can even see it, but now it's gone. When the lava cooled quickly, the plateau contracted and cracked, forming 40,000 columns of varying heights that look like giant stepping stones. The largest stand almost 36 feet tall. According to legend, an Irish giant by the name of Finn McCool constructed the causeway so he could skip over to Scotland to defeat his Scottish counterpart, Benandonner, I think. While in transit to Scotland, Finn fell asleep, and Benandonner decided to cross the causeway to look for his competitor. To protect her slumbering husband, Finn's wife gathered him up and wrapped him up in cloth to disguise him as a baby. When Benandonner made it to Northern Ireland, he saw the large infant and could only imagine how big Finn must be. Frightened, Benandonner fled back to Scotland, but the causeway remained. Sorry, like everything sticks to this sweater. Like literally, it's impossible to get it clean. Anyway, sorry about that. Alright, 2 more places, I believe. Yes. Yeah, that's going to be the end tonight after these 2 in Scotland. This is Fingals Cave in Oban, in Argyll, and Bute. Not sure. Like something out of an epic fantasy novel, Scotland's Fingals Cave is a 270-foot deep, 72-foot tall sea cave with walls of perfectly hexagonal columns. Celtic legends held that the cave was once part of a bridge across the sea, built by giants to fight one another. Science says it was formed by enormous masses of lava that cooled so slowly that they broke into long hexagonal pillars, like mud cracking under the hot sun. Check it out. So cool. When naturalist Sir Joseph Banks rediscovered the cave in 1772, it quickly captured people's imagination and inspired the work of artists, writers, and musicians. Composer Felix Mendelssohn wrote an overture about the cave in 1830. The same year, painter J.M.W. Turner depicted it on canvas. Thus was born a romantic era tourist site that is just as entrancing today. And lastly, sadly, is the Garden of Cosmic Speculation in Holywood and Dumfries and Galloway. Among the daffodils and daisies of the Garden of Cosmic Speculation are black holes, Fibonacci sequences, fractals, and DNA double helixes. Architectural theorist Charles Jenks and his late wife Maggie Keswick designed the 30-acre garden for their own property. Its aesthetic is guided by the fundamentals of modern physics, reflecting the shapes and patterns of the unfolding universe. Begun in 1988, the garden took almost 20 years to build, during which time Keswick succumbed to cancer. Jenks continued the project in her memory, occasionally altering designs in response to shifts and breakthroughs in scientific knowledge. The Human Genome Project inspired the DNA garden section, with its plant-threaded double helix. So this chapter, I've looked through this book a lot. This is like the shortest chapter besides some of like the American parts. The others are way, way, way longer. So I'm just going to end it there. If the next one was a little shorter, I would have read it tonight. But anyway, we'll dive deep into Europe next time we read this book. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good